In the first 4 episodes of this little series, Lechmere and the Whitechapel Murders, all of them, I dealt with the attacks that preceded the Autumn of Terror and then went through the 5 so-called canonical murders. Most investigators stopped there, yet there was a series of other murders and attacks included in the Whitechapel murder files that were held at Scotland Yard and were included on the list that we've been looking at, which Chief Inspector Swanson, the paperwork coordinator for the case at Scotland Yard, seems to have stolen from Scotland Yard at some point in his career, as it was found amongst his personal papers, and it has the Scotland Yard seal on the top of it. That, by the way, is the reason why so much of the evidence and the paperwork to do with the Jack the Ripper case has gone missing, because it was basically stolen mostly by other policemen. And so we've got a depleted set of files now at the Public Record Office. But coming back to these other attacks, given that there were these other attacks, it would be prudent to also investigate these to see, firstly, if they've got any commonality with the other Ripper cases, the other more accepted Ripper cases, to see if it's likely that the same person was responsible for all of these attacks. And secondly, we'll see if Charles Lechmere can be connected to them as well. The next one on the list, further down on the page, is described as an alleged attempted murder. So it's not even a murder, an attempted murder, and it's not even necessarily a genuine case. This is of somebody called Annie Farmer on Wednesday, the 23rd of November 1888. At 7:30 in the morning, that's much earlier than the other cases in this series, Annie Farmer, who's a 40-year-old prostitute, picked up a customer and returned to her lodging house, Satchel's lodging house at 19 George Street, at the heart of the sort of murder district. 2 hours later, at 9:30 a.m, which is the time on the list we just looked at, she screamed out loud and a man ran out of the lodging house saying, "What a cow!" possibly with an expletive. She appeared with her throat lightly cut, and it caused quite naturally a big commotion. Was this another attack by Jack the Ripper? But the police found that she had coins in her mouth and suspected that she had defrauded the man and slightly cut her own throat to cover her tracks or to get him into trouble. She was of the same class and age as the other victims, and it was in the same area as we just saw, but it was much earlier in the day, 7:30 to 9:30 in the morning. The location, in a lodging house, was semi-public and wasn't a discreet murder scene. The other indoors one, where Mary Kelly was murdered, was a private location. It doesn't seem to me to fit the Ripper pattern. The police agreed with that, and with the timing, early in the morning, and the location, it doesn't really fit Lechmere. He wouldn't have been spending 2 hours with her, although it is on his axis to work, just off Wentworth Street. But otherwise it just doesn't fit. And then it transpired that Farmer told the police she'd met the man 12 months before as well. So I would reject that one. Now, interestingly, when the Times reported on this incident on the 22nd of November, they said, whether the woman's assailant is the man wanted for the 7 recent murders committed in the district of Whitechapel is of course not known. When they said 7 recent murders, that implied that at this stage all of the murders from Emma Smith onwards were regarded as being by the Ripper. Now we come to Alice McKenzie. She was killed on Wednesday the 17th of July 1889, which was over 6 months after the death of Rose Mylett. Quite a long gap. She was about 40 years old and lived in Gun Street in Spitalfields over here. It's Gun Street. In a lodging house. At 12:40 a.m. So this is a little bit earlier. These events were a little bit earlier than the normal murders. 12:40 a.m. in Castle Alley, which was a well patrolled street by the police. She was found by P.C. Andrews with 2 stab wounds in the neck. These were probably fatal. Her skirts were lifted, she was left on display, and her stomach was mutilated with perhaps 10 wounds. It wasn't quite the same as before, the other standard Ripper victims, you want to call them standard Ripper victims. There was no slash of the throat, there were short cuts, but they were still fatal. The throat wasn't actually cut, but the vital veins and arteries were. She had been seen soliciting or rushing around the area by several people before she was killed. It was reckoned that she was killed between 12:25 and 12:40 because when she was found, because the ground underneath her body was dry and it started to rain. At 1:10 a.m, when Inspector Reed of the local CID saw the body, the blood was flowing from her neck, but within a couple of minutes it started to clot. This was again another of these factors used to time the time of death. The local doctor, Dr. Baxter Phillips, made the post-mortem, and in his opinion, the wounds were different from the Ripper type which he had seen before on other victims, with the throat not being cut but the arteries severed. Whereas now, Dr. Bond, who came to look at it as well, this time Dr. Bond thought the opposite and thought that it was indeed a Ripper crime. Robert Anderson was away when it happened, and he was determined again that it wasn't a Ripper crime, whereas his boss, Munro, did think it was a Ripper crime. So there was a lot of conflicting opinion on it. As for Lechmere, firstly, it's just off his main route, the Wentworth Street route. It's very close to the other Pickford's depot we've mentioned several times, the other one just over here, very close. But it has to be said, much earlier, the time of death round about sort of 12:30 a.m. in the morning. So for Lechmere to have done it, he must have left home earlier than normal. But that doesn't exactly rule him out. And if it was a Ripper crime, and if Lechmere is connected to all the other Ripper crimes, then it makes sense that he also did that one. Next on the list is the death of Rose Mylett on Thursday the 20th of December. You'll see that no time has been entered, and it's been headed as an alleged murder, which is probably why they didn't bother with the time and why this particular incident has been added at the bottom of the page as a bit of an afterthought. But it's a very interesting case for many reasons, and one that has been long been neglected. Rose Mylett was 39, properly Catherine Mylett, although she had been married to a man called Davis. She had been living at 18 George Street over here, the same address as Emma Smith had been living at, who was in the first episode that I discussed, and next door to Satchel's lodging house, where Martha Tabram had lived, and where the Annie Farmer incident took place, which we were just discussing. She literally lived next door. A lot of these prostitutes lived in the same lodging houses, so it's not exactly that surprising. At 7:55 p.m. on the 19th, she was seen presumably soliciting on Poplar High Street. At 2:30 a.m. on the 20th, in the early hours of the 20th, she was seen outside the George on Commercial Road. Some people have doubted the truthfulness of the witness who's placed her there. The George, by the way, the pub is still there. at 4:30 a.m, 2 hours later, her body was found between 184 and 186 Poplar High Street in Clark's Yard by Sergeant Golding. She was still warm. A post-mortem by Dr. Brownfield, the divisional police surgeon, decided that she had died by strangulation. Blood was coming from her nose, she had a slight abrasion on her face, and she had a mark of a cord around the neck, the front part of her neck, but not all the way around the back. Impressions of fingers and thumbs were on the side of the neck. It was like the doctor thought she had been strangled from the rear by a cord, and he said the deceased could not have done it herself. The divisional surgeon appeared at the inquest next day and gave that as his opinion. The police chief surgeon at Scotland Yard, Dr. McKellar, went to check, and he agreed with Dr. Brownfield. The local police were, I have to say, sceptical that it was a murder. That's why McKellar went as well. As a Dr. Bond, who was a favoured doctor with the police, his assistant also went down there, Dr. Hibbert, and he agreed it was death by strangulation. At this stage, Robert Anderson, the head of CID at Scotland Yard, went down there to check himself, and he was determined that it wasn't murder but some sort of accidental death. Dr. Bond was eventually found, and he was sent down there to check himself, and he agreed with the other doctors that it was willful murder by strangulation. That's 4 doctors there now agreeing it was murder. Anderson, the guy who's in charge of CID at Scotland Yard, had a meeting with Bond, sent him back to have another look, and hey presto, Bond agreed with his boss that it wasn't murder. But the inquest found that it was murder, and the coroner complained about the police sending multiple doctors down to second guess each other. But the police refused to agree and basically didn't investigate the case properly. Now, why? Why were they so determined that it wasn't murder? Well, Anderson. A lot of people say that it's because his Montague Jewett, for example, was found in the river on the 31st of December. That was about 10 days later. But the allegation is that his brother perhaps was going around looking for him. They knew he was dead, and so they didn't believe that this could be a Ripper crime because of Jewett. But that doesn't really fit, not least because Anderson didn't really favour Jewett as being the Ripper. He was more inclined to think it was a Jewish suspect, and so some people think that David Cohen, who was sent to jail, who was brought in front of a court and sent to an insane asylum after the 7th of December, a couple of weeks before the death of Rose Mylett, because of David Cohen's incarceration in an asylum, that Anderson perhaps knew it wasn't a Ripper murder. But that doesn't really work. The real reason for this, in my opinion, is that Anderson's boss, Warren, had been forced out by the Ripper crimes a few weeks before. He'd been replaced by James Munro as commissioner, and basically they wanted the Ripper crimes to be over. They didn't want any more Ripper crimes, and so he was determined that Rose Mylett was not a murder. It was some sort of horrendous accident. Here's a bit of a coincidence, though. Clark's Yard, between 184 and 186 Poplar High Street, is just a few doors down from 178 Poplar High Street, which is where Liz Stride and her husband John Stride had a coffee shop between 1871 and 1874. But that can only have been a pure coincidence that they were a few doors down, but it was because it was sort of 14 years before. A few doors further down from Liz Stride's coffee shop was a brothel. That was identified by Charles Booth. I said Charles Booth, his inspectors had found brothels in Pyncheon Street, Breezers Hill area in the last episode. He also found one on Poplar High Street a few doors down from Clark's Yard. Go another few doors down to 107 Poplar High Street on the other side of the road, and there was a whacking great big Pickford's depot, believe it or not. Interestingly also, the yard, in Clark's Yard, there was a blind maker, a business making window blinds and cords, and one of these cords may conceivably have been used to strangle Rose Mylett with. By coincidence, for future reference, several of the Thames Torso victim bodies were found bound up or bundled up with Venetian cord bindings. Now, I'll go back to the George, the pub The George, where Rose Mylett may have been seen. It may or may not be of interest that it was very close to Lechmere's old house at James Street, and on the route between his other house where he lived briefly, which is before he moved to Doveton Street. That was the furthest he ever moved from his mother's house, and the George is in that sort of area. So there may be a connection there. But more pertinently, as I just mentioned, the crime scene was very near a big Pickford's depot just here. There was another Pickford's depot here. It was between two different Pickford's depots and was close to Poplar Station, which is just up here. Poplar Station, which is on the direct line on the North London Railway to Broad Street, where Lechmere worked. So there's easy connections to Lechmere. Was it a Ripper crime though? I tend to think it was murder, and perhaps the culprit was disturbed and made his escape without the people who disturbed him being aware that they had disturbed him, and that's why there was no knife wounds of any description on the victim. It doesn't fit the timescale for Lechmere normally, but being the location of these Pickford's depots, he could have been there for exceptional reasons, to do some other particular work to do with those depots outside of his normal time frame. So there's a clear potential for Lechmere to be involved in it if it was a Ripper crime. The next case is missing from the list. It's the Pinchin Street torso. The papers were included amongst the Whitechapel Murder files held at the National Archive, but isn't on this list of Donald Swanson's. It's one of the most important cases that, as far as I'm concerned, as it represents a potential crossover between the concurrent Thames Torso murders and the Jack the Ripper murders. It's a crime that personally had great significance for me when I first started investigating the connections between Charles Lechmere and the Ripper case. I initially was very sceptical, but when I investigated the particulars about the Pyncheon Street torso, it was the final nail in the coffin, for reasons which will hopefully become apparent. A torso, the body minus the legs and the head, which were never found, was discovered at about 5:15 a.m. on Tuesday the 10th of September at a railway arch at the end of Pyncheon Street, near its junction with Backchurch Lane, by PC William Pennett, who had smelt the decaying flesh. The torso was roughly covered by an old chemise, a light female undergarment, and Pennett had been around about 20 or so minutes before, and on that occasion he had smelt and seen nothing, so that narrows down when the torso must have been dumped, around 5 o'clock probably. It was a female, and she had been dead for some time and was decomposing. The estimates are that she had been killed roughly 2 days before, on the 8th of September. The abdominal area had been mutilated. The body was taken to the mortuary at St George's in the East, which was the same place where the body of Liz Stride had been taken, and the inquest took place in the vestry hall of St George's, which was also the same place where Liz Stride's inquest took place. The identity of the woman was never established. The manner in which the head and legs had been removed was identical to the torsos found at Whitehall in the new Scotland Yard buildings, which were being built at the time, on the 3rd of October 1888. Also to the Elizabeth Jackson torso of June 1889, parts of which were found in Battersea and Chelsea and other parts floating on the Thames, and the so-called Rainham torso of 1887. So the Pyncheon Street torso links directly to those three other torsos at least. There was a common method of cutting the body, and that's one thing that we're going to return to at a later date, although in an earlier episode I hinted at this. In fact, there are several curious factors within the Pyncheon Street torso crime that have links to the night of the double event. Firstly, opposite the arch where the body was found was a fence where there was building work occasioned by the demolition of some buildings on the corner of Splid Street, just here. And there was a fence put up. On the fence was written some graffiti. The second piece of graffiti links to a crime scene in the Whitechapel series. Remember, the other part was at Galston Street. The graffiti simply said Lipsky, and remember, Lipsky was the name of a local Jewish murderer who had killed a woman in Batty Street. That was quite nearby. Batty Street's up here. In 1887. And Israel Schwartz, if you recall, said that one of the men he saw in Berner Street when Liz Stride was murdered had called out the word Lipsky just before she'd been murdered. So there's some strange connections with the double event. Lastly, a bloody rag was found in the foundations of the crypt of St Philip's Church, which was being built at the time. It was the church for the London Hospital, and that has a connection perhaps to the bloody rag that was found by the graffiti in the case of the of Galston Street after the murder of Catherine Eddowes. The bloody rag found it in the foundations of St Philip's Church, and that is actually where there's a museum of the London Hospital now, which has some Jack the Ripper memorabilia or artefacts in there, not memorabilia, artefacts in there, interestingly enough, in the crypt. Chief Inspector Swanson reported on the day the body was found: the question of how conveyed is in the region of theory, but if by hand, about 250 yards would be the limit. Consequently, inquiry has been made to find any shed or house or place within that limit so as to ascertain who, what and how the occupier was engaged, but more especially to find the missing parts. James Munro, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, reported on the 11th of September, which was the next day, it was so concealed in some place to which the murderer had access, over which he had control, and from which he was anxious to remove the corpse. We may say then that the murder was committed probably in the house or lodging of the murderer, and that he conveyed the portion found to Pyncheon Street to get rid of it from his lodging, where the odour of decomposition would soon betray him. And as to how the body got to Whitechapel, this is a great difficulty, unless it be supposed that the murderer had good knowledge of the locality. Charles Hibbert, who was involved in the Rose Mylett case, examined the body and concluded the incisions were evidently made with design, and was skillfully performed, as if by a man who had some knowledge of the position of joints and the readiest means of separating limbs, such knowledge as a butcher or slaughterer. They do not indicate a special anatomical knowledge of the human body. Now, why did this geezer, Edward Stow, get the heebie-jeebies about Lechmere when he read up about the Pyncheon Street torso? Well, in the 1861 census, Charles Lechmere is listed as living at 13 Thomas Street. He was about 11 years old, and this is the one time when he was listed in any record as Cross, as his bigamous stepfather, Thomas Cross, was still alive then and would have been the person telling the census enumerator the family details. Now, you won't find Thomas Street on any map, as a few years later it was renamed Pyncheon Street. And this is roughly where they lived. Thomas Cross died in 1869, and Lechmere's mother, Maria, remarried again, her second bigamous marriage, in 1872 to a guy called Joseph Forsdyke, who lived at 6 Split Street, a street I mentioned before, just opposite the arch on Pyncheon Street. The viaduct over which the arch ran was actually constructed in the mid-1870s, and some of the houses at the end of Split Street were demolished, including Maria and Joseph Forsdyke's house, which led to them moving from Split Street. Their house was demolished at the end, where the palings were put in place, in fact, that said Lipsky, if I remind you of that. They moved to a house on Pyncheon Street, very close to the house which was when it was called Thomas Street. So they moved from there to there. In about 1884, they moved again to Mary Ann Street, which is the address where I've been showing them previously in the series. Only a very short distance away. Mary Ann Street. They lived there during the Autumn of Terror. But in 1889, they moved again to Cable Street. There are two sources for this, which have a discrepancy in the street number. It was either 139 or 147, but it was here. So at the time of the Pyncheon Street torso, Lechmere's mother was living here. In December of that year, short time after the Pyncheon Street torso discovery, Joseph Forsdyke died of senility. So, to recap here, Lechmere used to live in Pyncheon Street. He was very familiar with this area. Lechmere's mother's first house with her second bigamous husband was demolished to construct the arch that the body was found in. Lechmere's mother then went to live at another address in Pyncheon Street, and by the time of the torso, she lived around the corner on Cable Street, just outside the 250-yard search area, but within torso lugging distance. At that time, Forsdyke, the stepfather, was senile. The bloody rag I mentioned that was found in the foundations of the church is on a direct route back to Lechmere's house at Doveton Street. I told you about the graffiti, the coincidence of the graffiti and the Lipsky connection with a double event. The Pyncheon Street torso also had abdominal injuries, mutilations, like a classic Ripper victim. As we'll see in future episodes, there were similarities in the way at least one of the torsos was cut up and the way Mary Kelly was attacked. We'll examine all the other torsos at a later date in the house of Lechmere. There's one other big key factor here. Lechmere's mother Maria went into the cat's meat business in quite a big way. Indeed, the cat's meat business was a big sideline for the Lechmere family, involving his son, his grandson and great-grandchildren right up to 1943. They were not common street hawkers, but wholesalers. They obtained big sides of dead horses and cut them up and prepared them for sale. I suggest the woman was taken back to Lechmere's mother's house. Perhaps Lechmere's mother was out with her sickly husband. Perhaps he'd been admitted temporarily to a hospital prior to his death. In any case, he was senile and wouldn't have really known what was going on. The woman was killed and dismembered, and her parts were hidden amongst the horse flesh that was being prepared for cat's meat. A couple of days later, the stench got too bad as the body decomposed, or perhaps they'd returned from hospital and Lechmere had to get rid of the body, so he dumped it around the corner. It all fits like a glove. The last case chronologically on the Whitechapel murder list and in the Whitechapel murder files at National Archives is that of Francis Coles, who died on Friday the 13th of February 1891. That's another long gap, the longest gap of almost a year and a half after the Pyncheon Street torso. I'll start this account 2 days earlier, on the 11th. On this day, a 53-year-old merchant seaman called James Sadler was discharged from his ship in the docks in the St Catherine's docks, just south of this area, and he went ashore with a pocket full of money. He had met Frances Coles before, and he bumped into her again at the Princess Alice, a pub on Commercial Street. They spent the day drinking and the night in a lodging house in White's Row. These are all familiar locations. The next day, the 12th, they also spent drinking, including in the White Swan, which was linked to the Martha Tabram murder, just next to the Pickford's depot, the other Pickford's depot. But later that evening, Sadler was robbed, and suddenly Francis Coles lost interest in him when he had no more money. They were both thrown out of the lodging house at White's Row, as they didn't have the money to pay for a room, and they went their separate ways just after midnight. Sadler went to try to get back on his ship down in St Catherine's Dock, but ended up in numerous fights in this area, and eventually went to London Hospital with his injuries. At about 2:15 a.m, PC Ernest Thompson was walking his beat. This was actually his first ever beat patrol, because he was a very new policeman. He walked from the direction of Leman Street down Chamber Street, and as he got near the opening of Swallow Gardens, he heard footsteps going in the direction of Mansell Street further down. He heard the footsteps going away ahead of him. He turned into Swallow Gardens, an alleyway that connected Chamber Street with what is now Royal Mint Street. It was then called Rosemary Street. It went under a series of railway arches, and he very soon saw the body of who turned out to be Frances Coles. She was still alive, and her throat had just literally been cut. As she was still alive, Thompson couldn't pursue the suspect, the man whose footsteps he heard going off in the distance. He had to stay with the body, but Frances Coles unfortunately died on a stretcher that was subsequently called to the scene. Sadler was the obvious suspect, but eventually all the charges against him were dropped. Now, 2:15 is the right general time in the morning for these sort of Ripper crimes. She was the right type of victim, a prostitute, but a bit younger than usual at 31. It was also in general, the right sort of district for the Ripper. and the particular location where it happened is the right sort of place, in an alleyway off a main thoroughfare. The arches are actually still there, but they're being redeveloped, and you can't go through the arch. The Swallow Gardens itself isn't there anymore. It's not a thoroughfare. The throat was cut, which is a very rare type of murder, but there were no abdominal wounds, but that was presumably because the murderer was disturbed. So you could say it could be Ripper related in many ways. For Lechmere, to be quite frank, it's off location. It doesn't seem to meet his route to work. It's off the route. It could have been, as I said, the White Swan was next to the Pickford's depot, but that was seen much earlier in the day. And it could have been Sadler, who although he got off the charges, it could have been Sadler after all. It's very difficult to know about the Francis Coles case because we don't really know exactly what Lechmere's movements are. Maybe he was casting his net wider, and that's why he found off what we would normally consider his normal route. And if he had to get to work by 4, then perhaps he detoured down here from his normal routes over here. But it's a very difficult one to get to the bottom of, the Francis Coles murder. This concludes the series, Lechmere and the Whitechapel Murders, but it does not conclude my investigation into the various murders around London that can be attributed to Charles Lechmere. The Whitechapel Murders, the Jack the Ripper murders were just one relatively short phase in a much longer campaign of terror. I will also look in greater detail at the many aspects thrown up around the murder of Polly Nichols and go through that evidence in much greater detail in future episodes. Hopefully I'll be joined by other experts in Jack the Ripper and in Charles Lechmere, so we can have a fruitful discussion about these matters. So that's something for you to look forward to. I'll also examine other things relating to Lechmere and his family and the factors that compelled him to commit these horrendous crimes. There's a lot more yet to come on the House of Lechmere, so please subscribe and thank you for watching.